Senator McCarthy.
Okay. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to thank the spirits of this place for giving us all the strength to be able to speak with such depth on an issue that our country wrestles with as black and white Australians. I'd like to acknowledge in the gallery Mr Acting Deputy President Jackie Huggins, Rod Little and Gary Oliver with Congress, and to thank them and all those who were able to speak directly to the hearts of all political leaders this morning here in Parliament House. I also would like to say to this Senate and to the Parliament that this day is an extraordinary day and an important day, because what it does is bring to the forefront the direct issues that impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It brings to the forefront of parliamentary leaders, of all Australians, the importance that is placed on the fact that the lives of Australia's First Nations people is still the most impoverished and disadvantaged. But it's also incredibly important in the way that it's extraordinary, because what we're wrestling with here is actually in this parliament. We're talking about a law that governs our country, but we're actually talking about two laws, Mr Acting Deputy President. Two laws. I am a Yanyuwa Garawa woman, Liantha Wiriara, Ngana Yanyuwa, Ngana Garawa, Yamalu, Baujibara, and I acknowledge the strength of my ancestors and the laws of the Yanyuwa and Garawa people in this House, and respect the fact that I am on the Awara, the country of the traditional owners for this land. So that's the two laws that I live with and respect. So when we come to a day like this, where the Parliament focuses specifically on First Nations people, it fills me with great pride, deep pride, not just for the Yanyuwa and Garawa people, and not just for the people of the Northern Territory, but for our country, for all Australians. Because as much as this report does not hold good news, and as much as this report tells each and every one of you what we all live, it also tells the First Nations people that this Parliament, this law, does acknowledge a wrestling of our conscience in this country. A wrestling of our conscience that no political party has the answer to on its own. That every political party, the major parties that have tried and continue to try, have all acknowledged here today the one thing that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been saying consistently since time immemorial, and that is work with us. Work with us, not for us, not to us, not against us, but work with us. I'd like to take you on a bit of a journey. In my way, we call it the Gujiga, the songline, the storyline. And Gujigas are really important, and that is the law of the Yanyuwa. The Gudjiga tells a story over thousands of years. It's not just one story, it's hundreds of stories. So as I travel from Borroloola through to Darwin, through to Tennant Creek, and then to Alice Springs, and then here to Sydney, that's a Gudjiga. That's a story, because we're travelling, and it's the songline. It's my songline. I remember the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. And we know that one of the targets that is not in the Close the Gap report is justice targets. The lead up to the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, there was one young woman, an outstanding woman, a young mum, who advocated strongly, who reminded this country that Aboriginal people were dying in custody at a rate that was such a phenomenon on a tragic scale. And she stood and faced media after media calling for something to be done. And she was not alone. But she stuck in my mind because at the time I had started as a journalist. And one of my first tasks to cover was the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. And I used to look at that woman, this Aboriginal woman, with her young baby in tow, as she'd faced the media, and I thought, wow, thank goodness for people like you, because you inspire me and you give me hope. And as I sat in the courts, listening to the different stories as to why an Aboriginal man had died, I would see now my colleague, Senator Dodson, and many others. And so I covered the story when Elliot Johnson, the Commissioner, was to release the recommendations. And I share this story because, again, it's about the challenge of working in a mainstream environment. We want people to have jobs, but we're forever conscious that we're trying to balance, if you like, the many expectations on us from our own family and culture and kinship, and balancing the expectations of the broader Australian society. And the woman who inspired me throughout that process sits in the gallery today, Jackie Huggins, who pushed and advocated for the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, and who today is still reminding the Australian Parliament that you must work with Aboriginal people, who today does not give up on the fact that, as imperfect as this parliamentary system is, we still have to work at trying to get it right. Is Congress the answer? I certainly think it needs every bit of support to get there. Are there many other answers? Of course there are. The other significant aspect of the Gudjiga and the story that I'd like to also share with you is the stolen generations. And yes, respect, recognise, restitution, absolutely critical in going forward in these next 12 months. In 2001, I covered another court case, and that was the Stolen Generations court case in the Federal Court, when Lorna Cabillo and the late Mr Peter Gunner took the Commonwealth to court over their forced removal from their families. And I covered that case. And while throughout that whole case, which was carrying the weight of all the stolen generation people in the Northern Territory, they stood in that court and they shared the most intimate of brutal details that occurred to them. while in the care of others under the Commonwealth. And yet, everything hung on their case. Every member of the stolen generation from the Northern Territory who needed that case to be won were to be disappointed because they lost. They lost the case. But in the findings, it was agreed that they did suffer sexual abuse. And so I look at the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sex abuse today. And I ask, as the Senator for the Northern Territory, why is it that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to tell their story again? What is wrong with our system of governance that doesn't just pick up a report that has already been acknowledged from one court case or one commission and carry it over here to this court case or to this commission without putting the same people through extreme pain and trauma compounded on further pain and trauma? That is what we as political leaders now need to really examine, is this system of governance, this law that fails at every step to give the justice, to give the satisfaction, to give the respect, and to acknowledge that there are two laws here that are clashing. We talk about resetting the engagement with First Nations people. We actually have to start the engagement with First Nations people. We have to acknowledge that there are many nations here in this country. And if we are to move towards constitutional recognition, which we so strongly believe we have to, there are many other things that must be discussed on that journey. And those things will further be discussed as people gather over the next few months. But I say to the First Nations people of Australia, don't give up. Don't give up. This wrestling of the consciousness of this country, of the conscience of this country, can only find a way if we find it together. But it does need the wisdom of the spirits, the good spirits, the strong spirits, the positive spirits, from the Yolngu Nation to the Larrakia Nation to the Yarrowua Nation to the Aranda Nation to the Yorta Yorta mob, right across the east, again to the west, to the Palawa in Tasmania. Don't give up, you mob. Find your spirits, because when your spirit is strong, it gives strength to the rest of us. It gives strength to the rest of us to find a better way. That wrestling of this country's conscience will continue, and so it should, until we get it right. I'd like to just conclude by addressing the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. And I want to say to him that we see what you do and what you try and do in your party room, with your cabinet colleagues, and as you travel across Australia. And we know that you make many mistakes, but there is no doubting the strong intent behind what you do to improve the lives for the First Nations people in this country. And I want to say thank you for that. And I want to say to the Opposition Leader, Bill Shorten, and to the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, that when you can both stand and reach a higher point in politics for the betterment of First Nations people in this country, it can only be much better for all Australians in this country. So that's why, having closed the gap and this day as a critical conscience moment for this Parliament, will always be important. Always be important. Because we do lose way too many people, too early, too soon, who are being jailed at rates that are outrageous for a country like ours. So to all First Nations people, say thank you. But let's stay strong, let's keep going. And to the parliamentarians of both houses, let's get this right, hey? Yo, Bo Jubara.